A lot more apples on this one. Just in the wood line off this side of the path. I don't know if you guys can see this. This grizzled old apple tree with these small little greenish, yellowish apples on here. You know, when I was a kid, we'd always find apple trees like that sometimes in the woods. They always had small apples, always some ancient looking tree. And I always assumed as a kid that the apples were small and not really that good to eat and super sour, just because no one was taking care of the tree and it was just kind of wild in the woods. You know, you learn about Johnny Appleseed in elementary school and you think that, hey, I wonder if Johnny Appleseed planted this tree. But in general, you might try to eat some of the apples, but they're really kind of sour and not great for eating. There's normally tons of bees around there and yellow jackets trying to eat the apples. You know, I got older, I started realizing or learned a little bit more about apples and know that apples are not true to seed. So the seed you get from an apple will almost never be the same as the type of fruit that it came from. So you hear that and start to wonder, how does the story of Johnny Appleseed make any sense if he just goes around Ohio and the Midwest planting apple trees and somehow delicious apples grew? So the adult version that I learned later on in life is that the modern apple that we eat today is really only became really popular in the 1900s. People wanted a tasty apple that was good to eat and an apple that traveled well and kept well so it looked good in the grocery store. But that wasn't the goal of apples when they planted apple trees back in the 1800s. On the American frontier, the whole reason, or the primary reason for planting apples, was to be able to make apple cider. So back then, the American frontier, clean water and water that didn't make you sick was actually pretty hard to come by and pretty scarce. So it was a pretty valuable resource for people establishing new homesteads and new farms to be able to have these sour apples that were actually the preferred type of apple for making things like hard apple cider, because hard cider kept well, it was safer to drink because of the alcohol content, and wasn't as dangerous as water to drink in the days. So that's the part about Johnny Appleseed that you don't learn as a kid, that he went around planting those type of apples and then grafting and setting up apple orchards. But you find those old apple varieties and they're always really sour and have these little apples. It's because they were planting apple orchards to make apple cider, because that was the primary purpose for them. Even kids were drinking hard apple cider back in the day. A pretty interesting thing to think about. But yeah, that's the rest of the story with Johnny Appleseed and why you see those small sour apples randomly growing in old fence rows and old lines and old places in the woods that are kind of forgotten about. I've also heard recently that there's been a lot of interest in those heirloom or legacy varieties of apples, because apples not being true to seed, those different varieties that have been planted and abandoned in different areas are really the only version of those varieties. So there's people who really get into that type of stuff and graft some of the branches from some of those old ancient trees before they die, and to keep those old traditional heirloom varieties growing. Here's another plant here. This is mullein, or cowboy toilet paper they call it. Just find it growing everywhere. But yeah, I thought that was an interesting story with the apple tree. So if you're out in the woods in the Midwest and you happen to see an old fence row and an old farm site or somewhere in the woods and an old apple tree, may or may not have been planted by Johnny Appleseed, but that's why the apples are small and sour, not great to eat. Morning. They're raising them for apple cider. That's the rest of the story.